I never wanted to go back to the orchard. It had been nearly 15 years since I last stepped foot on my grandparents' property. After they passed, the family let the land sit, untouched and overgrown, the apple trees twisting and sprawling as though the earth itself was reclaiming them. I used to love that place as a kid. The endless rows of trees, the sweet scent of apples ripening in the sun. But the night my cousin Ellie disappeared changed everything. I still remember how the adults scoured the property, calling her name until their voices were hoarse. How the orchard seemed darker than it should have been, even in the daylight. How they found nothing but her red jacket, tangled in the branches of an old, gnarled tree in the center of the grove. The orchard was cursed, they said. Some of them meant it figuratively, others quite literally. Either way, no one ever went back after that. Until now. The letter arrived 2 weeks ago, postmarked from a town I'd never heard of. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message was clear. The orchard remembers. Come home. It was signed only with an E. I almost threw it away. I wanted to, but something about the letter gnawed at me. I hadn't thought about Ellie in years, but her face flashed in my mind every time I looked at that looping signature. So I drove back. The road leading to the orchard was overgrown, the gravel barely visible beneath years of weeds. The house itself was a shell of what it used to be, its windows shattered, the roof sagging, and ivy creeping up the walls. But the orchard looked the same. The trees stood in perfect rows, their branches heavy with apples that gleamed in the fading sunlight. The air was thick with the scent of them, sweet and cloying, but there was something else underneath it, a faint, sour smell that made my stomach churn. I parked the car and stepped out, the crunch of gravel underfoot unnaturally loud in the stillness. The letter was crumpled in my pocket, and I ran my fingers over it nervously as I approached the first row of trees. A breeze stirred the branches, rustling the leaves, and for a moment, I thought I heard a voice. It was faint, almost too soft to catch, but it sounded like a whisper. Come closer. I froze, my pulse quickening. The whisper was faint, carried on the breeze like the rustling of leaves, but it wasn't natural. It had form, intention, as though it were meant just for me. I shook my head, trying to push the thought aside. It's the wind, I muttered, but the words felt hollow, like I was lying to myself. The orchard stretched ahead, its rows of apple trees casting long shadows across the ground. The sunlight was fading fast, and the cool evening air carried that sour undertone, growing stronger with every step I took. I hesitated at the edge of the first row. The trees looked almost alive, their gnarled branches twisting together like hands reaching for each other. As a kid, I'd found them beautiful. Now they seemed menacing. The whisper came again, closer. This time it was louder, distinct. A single word that sent a shiver down my spine. Ellie? I called, my voice shaking. The sound echoed faintly, swallowed by the oppressive stillness of the orchard. No answer. I clenched my fists and stepped into the rows of trees, the crunch of leaves beneath my boots unnaturally loud. The air grew colder as I walked, the smell of apples and rot thickening, clinging to my skin and clothes. The further I went, the stranger it felt. The orchard was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no insects, not even the faint rustle of animals moving through the underbrush. Just silence. And the whispers. They came from everywhere and nowhere at once. Faint and indistinct, like voices layered over each other. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, beckoning. My hand brushed against one of the trees as I passed, its bark rough and cold. The leaves above me rustled, though there was no breeze, and I swore I saw something move between the branches, a shadow, quick and fleeting. I spun around, my heart pounding. Who's there? Silence. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again. A figure, darting between the trees, too fast to be human. Ellie! I shouted, chasing after it. My boots slipped on the damp ground as I ran, the shadows growing darker with each step. The rows of trees blurred together, their twisted branches reaching for me as I passed. The figure was always just ahead, slipping out of sight as soon as I got close. I couldn't see its face, only its outline, a small, childlike form that moved with unnatural speed. "Wait!" I gasped, skidding to a halt. The figure stopped. It stood just ahead, at the edge of a clearing, its back to me. The whispers around me grew louder, overlapping and urgent, their words still impossible to understand. "Ellie," I said again, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure turned slowly. It wasn't Ellie. The figure turned toward me, and my breath caught in my throat. It was small, childlike, with a thin frame draped in tattered clothing that hung off its body like rags. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and its face, if it even was a face, was obscured by shadows. Only its eyes were visible, pale and gleaming, reflecting the fading light like the surface of a murky pond. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. "Oh, who are you?" The figure didn't answer. It just stood there, unmoving, as the whispers around me grew louder. The voices were overlapping now, too many to count, a cacophony of urgent tones that pressed against my ears like static. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to get as far away from the orchard as possible. But my legs wouldn't move. The figure raised one thin arm, pointing deeper into the clearing. The whispers stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing and the faint rustling of leaves above. Slowly, I followed the figure's gesture, my eyes landing on a tree at the center of the clearing. It was taller than the others, its branches gnarled and twisted, and its bark blackened as though it had been burned. Apples hung heavily from its limbs, larger and darker than any I'd ever seen. They glistened faintly, their surfaces slick and wet, and the sour smell I'd been noticing was strongest here, thick and suffocating. But it wasn't the tree that held my attention. At its base was something else, something familiar. A red jacket. My stomach turned as I took a step closer. The jacket was torn and faded, its once vivid color dulled by time and dirt. It was tangled in the roots of the tree, as though the earth itself had tried to swallow it. "Ellie," I whispered, my voice shaking. The figure moved, stepping closer to the tree. Its movements were slow and jerky, as though it were being controlled by invisible strings. When it reached the jacket, it knelt down, its pale eyes fixed on me. Then it spoke. The voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it echoed through the clearing like a scream. "She's still here." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My vision blurred, and for a moment, the world seemed to tilt. What do you mean?" The figure didn't answer. It reached out, its thin fingers brushing against the red fabric, and the ground beneath the tree began to shift. The roots twisted and writhed, pulling the jacket deeper into the earth. The tree groaned, its branches swaying as though caught in a storm, and the whispers returned, louder and more frantic than ever. "She's still here," the figure repeated, its voice distorted and echoing. And then the ground opened up. The ground beneath the tree split apart with a deep, resonant crack, the sound echoing through the orchard like a thunderclap. The roots twisted and pulled, exposing a dark, yawning void that seemed to swallow the faint light of the clearing. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move. It knelt by the edge of the hole, its thin fingers gripping the soil as though it were peering into something unseen. The whispers surged, frantic and chaotic, their overlapping voices forming a single, chilling command. "Go down." My heart pounded. "What is this?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "What's down there?" The figure turned to me, its pale eyes glinting in the darkness. "She's waiting," it said, its voice hollow and distant. A faint sound rose from the hole, soft, muffled, like someone calling out from far away. It was barely audible over the whispers, but it sent a shiver through me. "Ellie?" I whispered. The figure nodded. "No," I said, shaking my head. "She can't be. She's gone. She's waiting," the figure repeated, its tone unchanging. The sound grew louder, more distinct, until it was unmistakable. A voice, weak and pleading, calling my name. "Please," it said. "Help me." My legs felt like lead as I stepped closer to the hole. The air around it was cold and damp, carrying that sour, rotten smell that made my stomach churn. The whispers softened, their tones turning almost soothing, urging me forward. "You must go down. You must bring her back." I peered into the hole, the flashlight in my hand trembling as I shone it into the darkness. The beam barely penetrated the void, illuminating rough, dirt walls that disappeared into shadow. The voice came again, louder now. "Please, I'm down here. Ellie," I shouted, my voice breaking. I didn't want to go down. Everything in me screamed to turn and run, to leave the orchard and never come back. But the sound of her voice, so familiar, so desperate, kept me rooted in place. The figure stood, its movements jerky and unnatural, and pointed toward the hole. "You must go," it said. My hands shook as I gripped the edges of the opening, the dirt crumbling beneath my fingers. The whispers swirled around me, their voices weaving together into a single, chilling refrain. "The orchard remembers. The orchard keeps." Taking a deep breath, I swung my legs over the edge and began to climb down. The earth was cold and damp against my hands, and the sour smell grew stronger with every step. The beam of the flashlight bounced off the dirt walls, casting long shadows that seemed to twist and writhe. The whispers followed me, faint but persistent, their voices growing fainter the deeper I went. The air grew colder, heavier, and the soft sound of Ellie's voice echoed up from below, urging me onward. "Please," she said. "Hurry." My foot slipped, and I let out a sharp cry as I slid down the wall, the dirt tearing at my hands. I hit the bottom hard, the impact jarring my legs and sending the flashlight clattering to the ground. When I picked it up, the beam illuminated a narrow tunnel stretching ahead of me. The walls were slick with moisture, their surfaces marked with deep, jagged scratches. And at the far end of the tunnel, I saw her. Ellie. She was standing in the shadows, her red jacket bright against the darkness. "Ellie," I called, my voice echoing through the tunnel. She didn't move. Ellie stood at the far end of the tunnel, her red jacket glowing faintly in the beam of my flashlight. She didn't move, didn't call out again, just stood there, her back turned to me. "Ellie," I called, my voice trembling. Still, she didn't respond. The tunnel was cold, the air damp and heavy, and the sour stench of rot was nearly unbearable. I took a hesitant step forward, the soft squelch of the wet earth beneath my boots the only sound. "Ellie," I said again, quieter this time. "It's me. I'm here to bring you home." Her head tilted slightly, the motion slow and deliberate, but she still didn't turn around. The whispers had returned, faint and fragmented, their voices slipping through the cracks in my thoughts like water through a sieve. "Keep going," they urged. "She's waiting." I took another step, then another, each one heavier than the last. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, the shadows at its edges twisting and shifting as though they were alive. When I was only a few feet away, Ellie finally moved. Her head turned slowly, her movements stiff and unnatural, until I could see her face. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't Ellie. Her skin was pale and waxy, her cheeks hollow and sunken. Her eyes were wide and glassy, reflecting the light of my flashlight like mirrors, and her lips were stretched into a strange, twisted smile. "Ellie," I whispered, my voice shaking. The thing wearing her face tilted its head further, the grin widening. "She's waiting," it said, its voice layered and distorted, like two people speaking at once. The flashlight shook in my hand as I backed away. "You're not her," I said. "You're not." The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "She is here. Do not stop." The figure took a step toward me, its movements jerky like a puppet on strings. "Stay back," I said, my voice rising. It took another step, and I stumbled backward, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly off the walls. The whispers were deafening now, their voices overlapping in a chaotic frenzy. "Where is she?" I shouted, desperation clawing at my chest. "What did you do to her?" The figure stopped, its glassy eyes fixed on mine. "She's still here," it said, Then it lunged. The figure lunged at me, its movements unnaturally fast and jerky. I stumbled back, barely managing to twist out of its reach as its cold, pale hands clawed at the air where I had just been. The flashlight slipped from my grasp, the beam spinning wildly as it hit the ground. Shadows danced across the walls of the tunnel, twisting and elongating like living things. "Ellie!" I shouted, though I didn't know why. That thing wasn't her. It couldn't be. The figure tilted its head, that grotesque grin still stretched across its face. "She's waiting," it said again, its voice echoing through the tunnel. It lunged again, and I turned and ran. The tunnel was narrow and uneven, the walls slick with moisture that soaked through my clothes as I stumbled against them. The sour stench was suffocating, filling my lungs with every gasping breath. Behind me, the figure's footsteps echoed, wet and heavy, as it gave chase. Its distorted voice called after me, the words incomprehensible now, blending with the frantic whispers that filled the air. The ground beneath my feet shifted, the mud sucking at my boots and threatening to pull me down. My legs burned as I pushed forward, desperate to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever that thing was. A faint light appeared ahead, flickering like a dying flame. I ran toward it, the whispers urging me on. "Do not stop. She is close." The light grew brighter, revealing another chamber at the end of the tunnel. Its walls were smoother here, carved with strange, looping symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. In the center of the chamber was a small pool of dark water, its surface perfectly still despite the chaos around me. And beside the pool, slumped against the wall, was another figure. I skidded to a halt, my breath catching in my throat. This one wasn't moving, its form curled in on itself as though it had been discarded. Its clothing was tattered and faded, but unmistakable, a red jacket. "Ellie," I whispered, stepping closer. The whispers surged, their voices frantic and overlapping. "She is here. She is here." I crouched beside the figure, my hands shaking as I reached out. The fabric of the jacket was damp and cold, its color muted in the faint glow of the chamber. The figure stirred. A hand shot out, grabbing my wrist with a strength that didn't match its frail appearance. Its head lifted, and I found myself staring into Ellie's face. Her real face, gaunt and pale, but unmistakably hers. "Help me," she rasped, her voice barely audible. The figure from the tunnel burst into the chamber, its distorted grin twisted into a snarl. Ellie's grip tightened on my wrist. "Don't let it take me," she whispered. "Please." Ellie's grip on my wrist was icy, her fingers trembling as they dug into my skin. Her eyes, wide and bloodshot, darted toward the figure lurching into the chamber. "Please," she whispered again, her voice cracking. "Don't let it take me." I turned to face the figure. Its movements were jerky, its limbs twisting at unnatural angles as it stepped closer. The grin that had once seemed grotesque was now replaced by a snarl, its glassy eyes locked onto Ellie. The whispers surged again, filling the air with a chaotic chorus of warnings and commands. "Protect her. Keep her here. The price must be paid." "What price?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the chamber. "What does it want?" Ellie's grip tightened, and she pulled herself closer to me. "It wants me," she rasped, tears streaming down her gaunt cheeks. "It's always wanted me." The figure stopped at the edge of the pool, its head tilting sharply. The water between us rippled faintly, the dark surface disturbed by something unseen. For a moment, everything was still. Then it spoke. "You do not belong," it hissed, its voice layered and hollow. "She is ours." The whispers screamed in unison. "Do not let it take her." The figure stepped into the pool. The water churned around its legs, black and viscous, as though it were alive. The sight made my stomach turn, but I didn't have time to think. "Ellie, get up!" I shouted, grabbing her arm. "We have to move." She shook her head, her body trembling violently. "I can't," she whispered. "I've been here too long." "No," I said, desperation clawing at my chest. "You're coming with me?" The figure snarled, lunging forward. Its skeletal hand shot out, reaching for Ellie, and I shoved her behind me, my own hands shaking as I faced the creature. "Leave her alone!" I screamed. The whispers grew louder, their voices forming a single, urgent command. "The pool! Use the pool!" I turned toward the water. The rippling surface seemed to glow faintly, the strange symbols on the walls reflected in its depths. "What do I do?" I shouted, panic rising in my throat. The whispers didn't answer, but Ellie did. "Push it in," she said, her voice raw and desperate. "That's the only way." The figure lunged again, its claws grazing my shoulder. Pain shot through me as I stumbled back, my feet skidding on the slick ground. The whispers screamed, "Now! Push it in!" Summoning every ounce of strength I had, I turned and slammed into the figure, driving it toward the edge of the pool. Its glassy eyes widened in surprise, its grin twisting into a snarl as it clawed at me, trying to regain its footing. With a final, desperate shove, I sent it tumbling into the water. The pool erupted, the dark liquid churning violently as the figure thrashed and howled. Its distorted screams filled the chamber, echoing off the walls as the water pulled it under. Ellie clung to me, her trembling body pressed against mine as we watched the figure vanish beneath the surface. The chamber fell silent. The pool was still once more, its surface smooth and unbroken. I turned to Ellie, my chest heaving. "Is it over?" She didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the water, her face pale and expressionless. And then the whispers returned, soft and mournful. "It is not done." Ellie's silence unnerved me. Her grip on my arm had slackened, and her eyes stayed fixed on the still, dark water of the pool. The whispers were faint now, weaving around us like a distant, mournful song. "What do you mean it's not done?" I asked, my voice trembling. "It's gone." I pushed it in. Ellie finally turned to look at me, her face pale and drawn. "It's not gone," she whispered, her voice hollow. "It never goes away. It just waits." I shook my head, trying to make sense of her words. "Waits for what?" "For the trade," she said, her gaze falling to the pool. The whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping in a chaotic hum that made it hard to think. "The balance must be restored. The trade must be made." "What trade?" I demanded, my frustration boiling over. "What are you talking about?" Ellie's expression crumpled, and tears welled in her eyes. "It's how I've stayed here," she said. "All these years. It let me stay, but only because someone else took my place." Her words hit me like a blow. My mind reeled, and I stumbled back, nearly slipping on the slick ground. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "That's not possible. That's not." The pool rippled again, the dark water shifting as though something beneath its surface was stirring. The faint glow of the chamber dimmed, and the air grew heavy with that same sour, rotting smell that had followed me since I entered the orchard. Ellie clutched at my arm, her voice trembling. "You shouldn't have come here," she said. "It wasn't supposed to be you." The whispers surged, their voices sharp and urgent. "It is time. The balance must be restored." "No," I said, backing away. "No, there has to be another way. I came here to save you." Ellie's tears spilled over, streaking her pale cheeks. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I thought it would be someone else. I didn't know it would be you." The water in the pool churned violently, its surface glowing with an eerie, pale light. The whispers grew deafening, their voices merging into a single, chilling command. "Take your place." A force slammed into me, knocking me off my feet. I hit the ground hard, the air rushing from my lungs as invisible hands dragged me toward the edge of the pool. "No!" I screamed, clawing at the ground. "Ellie, help me!" She stalled, her face twisted with guilt and sorrow. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't go back." The force pulled me closer to the water, its cold grip tightening around my limbs. The surface of the pool shimmered, and for a brief moment, I saw my reflection staring back at me. But it wasn't my reflection. The face in the water was twisted, hollow-eyed, and grinning. The reflection in the pool grinned up at me, its jagged smile impossibly wide. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and a wave of nausea rolled over me as I realized it wasn't just watching. It was waiting. The force dragging me toward the water grew stronger, pulling me closer to the edge. My hands scrambled for purchase on the slick ground, dirt and mud slipping through my fingers as I fought against the pull. "Ellie!" I shouted, panic clawing at my throat. "Help me!" Her face was a mask of anguish. She shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I can't," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It'll take me back." The pool's surface rippled, the reflection twisting and warping until it no longer resembled me. It had taken on a life of its own, its distorted face shifting and changing, its grin splitting wider. "You cannot resist," it hissed, the voice echoing from the water and inside my head. "The trade must be made," I screamed, my hands clawing at the dirt as the invisible force dragged me closer. The whispers were deafening now, a frenzied chorus urging me forward. The balance must be restored. My body slid to the edge of the pool, the icy water lapping at my boots. I kicked and thrashed, my movements frantic, but the pull was relentless. The reflection in the water leaned closer, its pale, skeletal hand reaching up from beneath the surface. I felt its cold fingers brush against my ankle, and a jolt of icy pain shot through my leg. "No!" I screamed, kicking at the hand with all my strength. My boot connected, and the water erupted, spraying freezing droplets across my face. For a moment, the pull lessened, and I scrambled backward, dragging myself away from the edge. My breath came in ragged gasps as I looked up at Ellie. She was standing now, her red jacket glowing faintly in the dim light of the chamber. Her face was pale, her expression torn between guilt and desperation. "There has to be another way," I shouted at her, my voice hoarse. "Help me, Ellie." Her gaze dropped to the pool, and she shook her head. "There isn't," she whispered. "It's you or me." The reflection in the water snarled, its jagged grin twisting into a grotesque snarl. The hand burst from the pool again, followed by another, then another, skeletal limbs clawing their way toward me. The whispers screamed in unison. "Take your place." Ellie stepped forward, her face hardening. She grabbed my arm and pulled me back, her strength surprising as she dragged me away from the pool. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling, "but you can't save me." Before I could respond, she shoved me aside and stepped toward the pool. The hands reached for her instantly, gripping her legs and arms, pulling her down with inhuman strength. Her face twisted in pain, but she didn't resist. "No!" I shouted, lunging toward her. She turned to me one last time, her eyes filled with both sorrow and relief. "Go," she said, "before it changes its mind." The pool erupted in light, blinding and cold, and I was thrown back against the wall. When the light faded, the chamber was empty. Ellie was gone. The chamber was silent now. The whispers were gone, the pool still and dark once more. My breath came in shallow gasps as I pulled myself to my feet, my body aching from the impact. "Ellie?" I called, my voice echoing faintly. There was no answer. I stumbled toward the pool, the flashlight trembling in my hand as I shone its beam across the surface. It reflected nothing. No light, no movement, just an endless black void that seemed to absorb everything around it. "Ellie!" I screamed, my voice cracking. The only response was the faint rustle of the symbols on the walls, their glow flickering like a dying ember. The whispers didn't come back, but their absence was almost worse. The silence pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating, as though the chamber itself was holding its breath. She was gone. My legs felt weak as I turned away from the pool, the sour stench of the air clinging to my clothes and skin. I stumbled toward the tunnel, the light from my flashlight dimming with every step. The scratches on the walls seemed deeper now, more chaotic, as though something had clawed at the earth in a desperate frenzy. When I finally reached the surface, the orchard was bathed in moonlight. The twisted rows of apple trees stretched endlessly in every direction, their shadows long and sharp. The sour smell was still there, faint but lingering, a reminder of what had happened below. I looked back toward the clearing. expecting to see the tall, blackened tree at its center. But it was gone. The orchard was quiet, as though nothing had ever happened. I made my way back to the car, my legs trembling with every step. The air was cold, and the weight of the silence hung over me like a shroud. As I reached the car, I paused and looked back one last time. The orchard seemed still, lifeless, but I could feel it watching me. The whispers had stopped, but the memory of their voices lingered, faint and haunting. The letter was still in my pocket, crumpled and worn. I pulled it out, my fingers shaking as I unfolded the paper. The words were the same, but beneath the signature, Ellie's signature, there was something new. The orchard remembers. I climbed into the car and started the engine, the sound breaking the oppressive silence. As I drove away, the rows of trees faded into the distance, their twisted forms swallowed by the darkness. But I knew I'd never truly leave. The orchard had taken Ellie, just as it had always intended, and now it had marked me,